I'm going to go ahead and turn off my music for now, go ahead and dive into more of the topic. And so let's just go into hearing a little bit from our co-hosts today. So starting off with Christina from AllVoices, would you mind telling us a little bit about what AllVoices does and why we're here?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Megan. And thank you to our partners at LifeLabs Learning and Enboarder. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm a senior partnerships manager at AllVoices. And just as a quick overview for AllVoices, we really build trust through hearing and action with our proprietary employee intelligence and communications platform to systemically ask for, accept, analyze, and act on employee feedback of all kinds, especially around managers. So this is a topic that we're really passionate about as well. And customers like Brooklinen, Zillow, GoPro Box, BuzzFeed all collect this feedback. So that's a little bit about us. If you have questions, just let me know.
Thank you, Christina. And Christina is co-hosting this event with Jen from Enboarder. Jen, would you mind telling us a little bit about Enboarder?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jen. Thank you, Megan and Christina, for having us here today. If you're not familiar with Enboarder, we are an experience-driven onboarding platform. So, companies like Shopify and Verizon, McDonald's, Hugo Boss, Gucci, they come to us when they realize that their onboarding is broken. Now, broken onboarding can mean a number of different things depending on your organization, but it typically leads to inconsistent and overwhelming experience for your new hires. Perhaps your HR team is spending way too much time on manual onboarding tasks, or you're struggling to engage the hiring managers, or you just don't have any visibility into the new hire journey. And so we help our customers by empowering HR and people operations teams, like much of the audience here with us today, to create scalable yet personalized onboarding experiences. This allows your team to actually focus on creating meaningful moments that matter during the new hire experience rather than just completing paperwork. We coach managers by delivering bite-sized nudges and content to help them along the journey and make sure they're completing their tasks. And ultimately, by creating these personalized experiences that focus on relationships, connection, your new hires become productive faster. They're more engaged, ultimately leading to better new hire retention. So if you're interested in learning more about us, you'll have an opportunity at the end to let us know. You can reach out directly to me. You can visit our website, but we're very, very happy to be here. And thank you to LifeLabs for having us.
Thank you both to AllVoices and Inborder for being a part of this program. This is going to be a really interesting event. If you've been to other LifeLabs sessions or events in the past, this is going to look a little bit different, which is why I'm so excited to also introduce up Denequa and Kara. So a couple of things that we're going to go to today. I'm going to share a very quick, high-paced, fast-paced skills training for about 20 minutes. And then we're going to spend the second half of this event more in a panel-like discussion, really seeing how have other companies actually put these skills into practice. So Denequa, I'll hand it over to you to share a little bit about who you are and what you'll be talking about today.
Thanks so much, Megan. Hi, everybody. I am Danielle Russell. I'm the manager of people operations and development here at Brooklinen. You might know us as the internet's favorite sheets. We pride ourselves on being the affordable luxury brand in the home category. We offer a large product mix of products for the bedroom, the bathroom, loungewear, accessories, and even our Spaces partner marketplace. So we're just super proud to be one of the largest direct-to-consumer home brands in the United States. And we're actively growing and continuing to expand our retail footprint as well as our international presence this year. So I'm really excited to be here and to share a little bit about the work that we're doing in the people space here at Brooklinen, from training and development, and really just to talk about how we're managing this hybrid/remote environment that we're all in today. Thanks so much, Megan.
Thanks, Denequa. Hey, Kara.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kirby, and I run a small boutique consultancy company that focuses on helping companies achieve people-first leadership practices. I have spent the past 15 years studying organizational development, studying remote work, and working for some of the most highly ranked tech companies that are out there. And now I have the privilege of working all over the world with different companies and helping them really scale the great things that they're doing. So happy to be here. Thank you for having me. And I'm so excited to be in the company of these awesome ladies that are here today.
I'm really looking forward to hearing more from both of you in the second half of today. So let's just go ahead and dig into some of the skills. And then again, we're going to pass it back to Denequa and Kara on the second half to really see how have these been operationalized? How have other companies actually put some of these skills into practice? So like I mentioned, I'm a leadership trainer at LifeLabs. Many of you might know what LifeLabs is all about, but for those of you that are new to the LifeLabs experience, a little bit of what we do is we actually do a lot of training, both in person and virtual. And we work with managers, executives, and teams in a variety of industries, some like you see here. And when we actually go in to offer trainings, we get access to a lot of information. So we're very research backed in the way that we approach our workshops. And we might go in and ask questions like, who here is a really good manager? Manager in a co-located environment, manager in a hybrid, manager in a remote team. What is it that they're actually doing that's different? We want to see what those behaviors are. What are those actual skills that we can then quickly train up and teach other managers about? So a lot of today's session is going to be really distilling some of the common trends, common themes that we noticed in our research, working with a number of managers. But since we have literally 790 plus of us and our brains and our experiences in the room, I would actually love to use this as an experience to get a little bit of data. So going to you all and your experience, seeing the changes that many of us have noticed in the teams, curious what comes to mind with the challenges that you've noticed with managing distributed employees. So let me give you a moment to think about this. Some challenges, what's different, what comes up, what's been difficult when it comes to managing distributed employees. And this is where we get all this data, getting to see a lot of the things into chat, probably some trends, probably some some similarities. And I'm noticing this as I even read through the comments. I definitely can't read this fast, but I am seeing that there are some trends. There are some things that we also noticed in our research as well. A lot of things around communication. What does the culture look like when we're not in the same place? How do we think about connection, team building, relationships, equity? A lot of these things we see again and again and again. And the interesting thing is that they show up whether we're co-located, whether we're distributed, but the amount of weight that we put on them can vary. And then what do we do in situations where we may have been operating fully virtually for the past 2 years? And now we're asking employees to shift, to change. What are those good habits that we noticed? What are those bad habits we want to break? So over time, we've had this opportunity to ask this question again and again, and we can really distill that there are some concrete core skills that are the same. What do great managers have in common? So we actually see these break down into 2 core elements of skills, these individual level skills like coaching skills, feedback, the idea of developing even psychological safety around feedback. We'll talk about that in the second half, those prioritization skills, accountability, like I mentioned. Effective one-on-ones, how do we actually use that time, especially focusing on managers, to have better one-on-ones? And then we can look at those team level skills, getting the team to think more strategically, use those meetings that we've seen more effectively, navigate through change and people development. So then we can go into what's the difference. So a lot of the things that we saw in the chat started to show up in terms of those differences. Those differences showed up in 3 critical areas. We have an entire workshop around this. It's 2 hours long, but just for time today, I'm going to spend the next 18 minutes or so diving into 3 critical areas that can be really, really effective. So especially given the audience that we have today, really thinking about this from a people operations perspective, if we were going to make some small changes that could have some really big impact, this is where I want us to focus. So when we're thinking about distributed management, we're going to focus on these 3 areas. We're going to talk about managing communication, strengthening connection, and really thinking about energy. How do we manage and support energy when there's some blurred boundaries around work and life and everything in between? So I'm seeing some questions in chat. Kushbu is mentioning we are going to share the recording from today, the notes from today, all of the resources from today will be sent to you after our conversation. So I actually want to dig into this first one around managing communication. And I want to start this off with kind of a bizarre exercise for us. And I know that we're all in various environments today, But if you have access to a piece of paper, I would love to ask you to grab that piece of paper. If you have access to a blank sheet of paper, ideally one that is not held so dearly for you, so not a special piece of paper, please grab that. And you can close your eyes. So I'll give a couple of seconds to find that piece of paper. This could be even digging it out of the recycling bin. Totally fine if we are paperless. All right, so if you got that in front of you, here's what I'm gonna ask you to do. I'd like for you to please fold that piece of paper in half and tear off the upper right-hand corner. Fold your paper in half again. And tear off the upper left-hand corner. Fold your paper in half again. And tear off the lower right-hand corner. All right, so if you actually unfold that piece of paper, you'll notice we all had the same instructions. This is what I was hoping we would end up with. But if we look at the comparisons, we may not all see that we ended up in the same result. So looking at the end result, how may we have ended up with variety? What are some of your thoughts on this? So just putting this into chat, what are some insights, reactions, especially as we think about this skill relating to creating a management training program? All right, so I thought I had pretty clear instructions. You could see them here, they were the same for everyone, but yet lots of variety in terms of where this comes from. So when we think about putting this into place, when we think about the skills that are necessary in creating a manager training program and thinking about what's going to be helpful for managers afterwards to continue those skills, the first fix is co-creating a playbook. Co-creating a communication playbook that will allow for managers in different time zones to make explicit what might be thought of as implicit, different expectations, different alignment, what the end result is, what's the goal. So having some of these written down and co-created with the team. So let me ask you all this. If I just kind of put a blank place here. What's the importance when it comes to co-creating this playbook? Maybe thinking about this in terms of the manager's buy-in, feedback, stakeholders. Who's the end user in the manager training program that we're all thinking about creating? What do they want to get out of it? What's their input? And what we know from research around autonomy, around voice, around feedback, is we're much more likely to be motivated and bought into the end result. So whether it's a playbook for constant conversations on the team, how do we want to actually establish a feedback culture? Or if it's really thinking about putting this into practice from a people ops perspective, how can we really look at bringing more folks into establishing better communication? We're going to come back into communication when I hand this back over to Denequa and Kara, really thinking about as they've put together manager training programs, how has this shown up? What have been the challenges that they've noticed and how have they addressed those challenges? But my one action for you all is thinking about co-creating a communication team playbook with your managers and team. Second thing I want to highlight is around connection. I think for many of us, we've noticed the importance of connection in the last couple of years, how challenging it's been for some, and the importance of this. But there's a deeper seated need that we have as human beings for belonging. This actually comes from survival. We as human beings are wired to constantly be tracking what we call in-group and out-group dynamics. This is a lot easier to do in a co-located situation. So when we have distance, it's really hard to know, am I included? Am I thought of? Do I belong? So the sense of social exclusion is actually triggered by distance. So as we think about even going back into the office, how are we going to think of addressing that sense of connection? What I'd like to offer now is a worksheet. This is a take home. There's nothing that you actually have to do for this, but if Khushbu, if you could help me paste that into the chat. The quick fix for connection is when we think about manager training programs, training managers up on the one-on-ones. Think about some managers you've had in your past. How did they utilize that one-on-one time with you to build that sense of connection? Especially in a distributed environment, that may be the one constant conversation that employees have. So Khushbu put the link into chat. You'll notice you don't have access to edit, so just go ahead and make a copy for yourself. This is yours to keep, gives you access to other resources that we have. But scanning through this sheet, if you have direct reports, pick one that you'd like to ask in your next one-on-one. A lot of people that we work with also create templates for their one-on-ones, templates for managers to be prepared to ask questions. We're going to hear more about that as well from Denequa and Kara as we hear more about creating these programs for their teams. But the number one takeaway when it comes to connection, especially while working with managers, is how do they actually continue that program of development in their consistent one-on-ones? What does consistency look like? How do they use those one-on-ones to not only talk about the work that needs to get done and checking on the work, but actually checking in on the human beings that they're working with? And the last thing that I want to cover in our skills-based session today is really thinking about, yes, it's important to think about making the explicit communication norms. Yes, it's important to train up managers to have better connection in their one-on-ones, but especially now more than ever, it's helpful to support managers. And how do they actually coach through energy? How do they actually coach through focus when there's so much change that we're all navigating in the world? So as we think about energy, there's a couple of problems that we see, especially for those folks that are working in a remote environment, or they're navigating back into having to commute again. How do they kind of build in that time where they didn't have it before? But when we're working from home, what we see are work-life boundaries begin to blur. In psychology, this is where we see this element of integration versus segmentation. For employees that are going into an office, there's natural segmentation of their day. They have a commute time. They arrive in an environment that is said, this is where we work. They close their computers, they leave, and that is their day being segmented. When we work from home, it's very blurry. It's called integration. We all know what this feels like, where it's like, let me get my laundry done. Let me kind of walk the dog. Let me see all the things that I might do outside of those work hours are now being integrated in, which can be really helpful and actually enjoyed by many. But this also creates ambiguity. And when we have that ambiguity, it can lead to a heavier cognitive load and often that feeling of burnout, where what starts off as high energy actually leads to feeling of distress. So the number one fix here, what we notice with managers is that not only can they use their one-on-ones to establish connection, but they can also be taught to focus on energy coaching. And what do I mean by energy coaching? Let me share a little bit of a personal example of what energy might look like for me in my day. I might start off with a little bit of lower energy earlier in the morning. I might reach my peak energy around 2 p.m., 1 p.m. But after that, my energy starts to go downhill until maybe I have that rebound later in the evening. This is what it looks like for me and what it looks like for many folks, but not for everyone. So what we do want to see is for skillful managers, they understand how to have conversations around energy, around actually managing energy through breaks, Not all of us can change what our work looks like depending on the time of day, but it can still be helpful to recognize where we feel our peak sense of energy and where we might need to take breaks. So for example, if I know that I'm in my peak phase of work, this might be a place that I want to do analytical work. I want to take on a big problem. I want to start to solve and think about strategy. If I know that I'm in my trough, my 4 p.m. lull of the day, maybe this is where I take a break, go for a walk, or do some lighter administrative work. Maybe I do some batch processing of emails. And then when I'm in that rebound phase, this is where we actually see a lot of really cool research around afternoon is a great time for creative work, for brainstorming, for collectively getting together, utilizing that energy on the outset. So that's the big idea here. We can start to think about coaching through energy, maybe asking questions that look like this. Not only do I love that these questions follow the same flow that you see on your worksheet. There's the question, what does it get behind? But there's also these follow-on questions, really teaching managers those coaching skills, deepening the questions they're asking, following on to learn a little bit more. I'm loving seeing some of the examples in chat around what you all have seen, what you all have noticed, how you've practiced no meetings on Wednesdays or focus Wednesdays. Really using that experimental focus to see what maybe worked 6 months ago in a different environment may not work for us now, but we have that experimental mindset. Let's have hypotheses. Let's see what works and what doesn't work. And so those are the 3 skills that I wanted to share with us today. We have workshops that are a lot longer, that touch on a lot of each of these topics in much more depth, really bringing in those managers. I'll share a little bit more about our experience with manager training, but I did want to take this time to bring back our panelists and really think and see and hear how other teams and other companies have really integrated the sense of communication, connection, and energy while creating their manager training programs. So Denequa and Kara, if I could invite you back up. I'm going to gallery view. You'll notice that Denequa and Kara are going to raise their virtual hands. That's going to keep them sort of at the front of the space for us. But we have, looks like 800 or so folks, 800 or so faces. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat to see if there are questions that you all have. But just to kick us off and really thinking about, as you both have launched programs around manager training, and given the context of what we just heard and kind of talked through in terms of our research at LifeLabs, I'm curious if you could share some of the key challenges that you've noticed, and especially in this hybrid and remote world, and how are you going about addressing those in your training programs? Denequa, can I kick it off to you first?
Absolutely. Thanks, Megan. I think one thing that is really top of mind for us here at Brooklinen all the time is this concept of strengthening connection. We really like to lean in with all of our training and programs, and even just the way that we communicate with one another. We like to lean into what we call empathetic leadership. And we really believe that having a good relationship with your direct report is the true foundation. It's the foundation of being able to give really candid and transparent feedback. It's the foundation of being a thought partner with your direct reports. It's the foundation of eventually managing conflict when it eventually arises, because conflict is not something we can avoid. So I like to think about it as making the deposits into the relationship to be able to make the withdrawals when the time comes. So deposits meaning spending the time in your one-to-ones, like Megan mentioned earlier, being very tuned into how your direct reports are doing, or even just giving positive feedback and positive reinforcement along the way. So we like to really utilize these intangible skills and really impart that knowledge to our managers and really encourage them to be able to prioritize that relationship. An example, one of our managers is he asked all of his direct reports in the beginning of meetings, he asked them how they're doing. And it's a very simple question. We all ask it in passing. And once he gets the answer, he follows up. He says, okay, how are you really doing? And it causes everyone to take a pause, and it makes them really think about that question. How are you really doing? It's a very simple but powerful question. And I think in this world of hybrid and remote work, a lot of the smoke and mirrors are stripped away. We don't have like the lunches to go with each other. We don't get to see the tangible work benefits and perks. And it really reveals the true strength of our relationships as team members, as managers and direct reports, and as just members of our larger organization. So I think that is one way that we go about addressing that sort of idea of connection in this hybrid and remote space, is really prioritizing the relationship and using that as sort of a catapult to be able to do all of these other things as a manager effectively and efficiently.
I love what you're mentioning there, especially kind of getting back into those skills that you want to integrate with managers, the coaching, the one-on-ones and the feedback. And that's going to be really helpful, even thinking about whether we're all remote or all in person. Kara, I'd love to, you had some thoughts on this as well, especially when we were talking earlier about the intentionality with manager training.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. And I love what you said, Denequa, about the smoke and mirrors goes away whenever you're in a virtual setting. And that's absolutely right. So what I always tell leaders is that in this virtual environment, we have to be even more intentional about every single thing that you do. So those one-on-ones aren't going to be in passing anymore. So you have to make sure that you are spending that time dedicated to that person. You learn how to ask good questions. You learn how to listen and quiet down that funnel, what I always say is in our heads, that wants to answer questions before the person's done talking, etc. And I think that whenever it comes to challenges, when we're building leadership programs remotely, like they're just opportunities. So the challenges is that people are done with Zoom. Like Zoom is very hard. We're kind of bored with it. It makes it so that, it's just, you're going to this another meeting. So the question to ask yourself is, how do we change up that experience? How do you integrate more technology? If you're having a workshop with leaders, how do you make it fun? How do you make it exciting? Because on the other side of these challenges, there's a lot of opportunity. For instance, you can get people together from across your organization and completely break down silos. So in my last organization, we started a remote leadership program before the pandemic. It was about 7 years ago. And one of the most impactful experiences we gave to people was forming relationships all over the organization. And when we're teaching leadership, when we're having these discussions about one-on-ones, about coaching, about emotional intelligence, about psychological safety, it has a way of bonding people together. So I would say, yes, there's challenges, but it's nothing that we can't overcome by making things more exciting and making it so that we're focusing more on the positive outcome of breaking down those silos inside of an organization.
Very cool. I love just the reframe of these challenges are also opportunity, and really thinking about how that can play out, especially as we start thinking about the element of safety. So much of what we've noticed with the trainings at LifeLabs and really working with managers as well is that element of psychological safety. And I think I want to talk a little bit more about that with you both in a moment. And just even that especially if we've started remotely or if we started our relationship virtually, how can we really think about a little bit of that FaceTime before we go into what we see a lot of managers doing, the walk and talks, or let's just do a phone call for this, or really getting more creative with some of these opportunities as well. And Denequa, when we were talking in preparation for this, you were mentioning how you really were thinking in this hybrid and remote world, supporting employees through enabling managers. So could you share a little bit about that actual training program that you did build? What did you notice in building out the program? What did you try?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to add a little bit of context, here at Brooklinen, we built out a customized managers training program for all of our managers, incoming and managers that have been here for a while. And our intent was really to provide them with the same resources and tools to be able to show up in their relationships with their direct reports in a very dynamic way, and in a very valuable and intentional type of way. And the one thing that was really top of mind for us in building out this program is that manager skills have always been important. They were important when we were in person. They're even more important now that we're in this virtual and space that we're working in. So I think what was really important to us is understanding that behaviors and leadership skills aren't tied to an in-person or remote experience. They're extremely transferable. And something that, is very particular to our business is we had experienced a lot of growth in the past 2 years, both from an onboarding perspective as well as internal growth. So we had a lot of new managers. We had a lot of new managers to Brooklinen. And it was really important for us to be able to just start them all off on the same level field and be able to be very clear about what our expectations were of them as managers. And so we partnered with Joy Sebesma. She's the founder and CEO of Scale Joy. And we built out this entire training program. And the result was a 2-day training, 2 sessions, 3 hours. And we basically walked our managers through the entire manager journey, as we called it. So everything from setting expectations to, communicating a vision, to delegation, to feedback, to coaching. And what we found, even, trying to deliver this training in this remote environment, is that there are a lot of things that you don't really think about in an in-person, environment. So we came up against a lot of roadblocks and a lot of challenges that we really had to work through. Think about everything from attention spans to the brevity of the content, to the pace, to how interactive we are, how many breakout rooms do we have? And I think in us having to hold ourselves accountable and building this training session, it really helped us to start to fine tune the material and really think about it from the recipient's standpoint, and really understanding how we can build all of these lessons that we're learning in building this training. How can we infuse all of these lessons that we're learning inside of the training? And I think, the best part about the frameworks that we were able to build and the mindset that we were in when we built it is really understanding that it's not about the tangible tools that we offer to our team members. It's really about the intangibles. So the behaviors, the way that they interact with their direct reports, the way that their direct reports are able to interact with them, and how do we empower them to even allow their direct reports to show up in a way that's really authentic to their relationship, and in a way that is beneficial to both of their growth here at Brooklinen. So that's just an overview of, how we built out the program here at Brooklinen.
I love that perspective, even kind of starting with you were mentioning of, and I hear this from so many companies that we're working with that have grown a lot over the past years. Not only are they growing internally, but that also means for the first time, maybe for some companies, they're actually hiring in managers. So the question, I saw some of these comments earlier on around the culture. Employees are asking and questioning what's happening to our culture, given growth, given these managers that haven't been with us for some time, and really getting into what you're mentioning, those elements of that, those intangibles, and how might we try to make them a little bit more explicit for our newer managers to be able to flourish here and to create teams that feel good. This kind of takes us into what we were talking about earlier. Kara was mentioning this element of psychological safety, and we all know it's so critical. And there's a lot of opportunity. I'll use your words with that. So not so much the challenges, but there's a lot of opportunity to do this really well in a hybrid world. So Kara, what are your thoughts on how do you enable managers to create an environment of psychological safety, especially in a distributed environment?
Awesome. So one thing I just want to say about the intangibles, I heard this the other day, is that we need to stop using the word soft skills and start calling them superpowers, because it's so necessary to be able to have these human skills and understand how humans work together, that we have to do away with this word soft skills, because it almost means that it comes second tier to hard skills, right? And actually that's not the case. We have to start with soft skills, even though we're doing away with that word. Okay, so psychological safety. Psychological safety is something really interesting, and I make this as a part of my content when I'm working with organizations now. We call it out, how to create a safe environment, or creating psychological safety. And I think that something that's interesting is that a lot of people don't understand the definition behind it. So it gets this bad rap of being soft, or being a therapist for employees, or coddling them. And that's not what it is at all. At its core, it's making an environment so people feel safe to put forth their ideas, because we innately do not like to do this. So 2 resources, if I know a lot of people on this call love books as much as I do. Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson, and The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety by Timothy Clark. Those are really, really good resources when it comes to this topic. But there's this quote that Amy Edmondson says is that people do not want to come across ignorant, incompetent, or disruptive. Our basic state is trying to avoid that feeling, so people stay quiet. I'll give you a quick story. Back in years and years ago, I used to ride with salespeople, and I would notice whenever I was doing these ride-alongs that there were these little things that they would do. So they would have like an Excel hack that would save them hours, or they would have a way that they would communicate with a customer that was unlike anything that I had seen. And I would ask them the question of, why don't you share this with the rest of the organization? And they would always discard it and say, no, but this is just my thing. I don't want to bring that forth, right? And I always thought, like, that is psychological safety, because if people felt safe enough to just put their ideas out there, all of those little innovations would bubble up into the organization and make that organization that much stronger. So I think when it comes to psychological safety, if we go into it knowing that people misunderstand what the definition is behind it, and we clear it up saying, this is not about coddling. This is about being honest. And this is about how do you create an environment so people can feel disruptive and competent, and they can just bring up what is on their minds, because we know we're going to get to a better solution. It changes the way that we talk about it. And then we can give them the skills to how to do it.
I love that idea of thinking truly about the trust that psychological safety is enabling in terms of the relationships that we have. And even in our conversations leading up to this, Denequa, you mentioned that there's like a couple of sticky things that you've noticed and be able to implement when thinking about psychological safety, given the programs you're creating.
Yeah, I think when we think about psychological safety, 3 things that we always try to keep top of mind and really talk about when we're in these conversations with our manager is number 1, know your team. Getting to know them and knowing, what motivates them, what demotivates them. Number 2 is holding space for your team, whether that is one-to-ones, whether that is you notice that they are lacking on energy one week to the next, really checking in with them. And 3, being present during that space, because it's one thing to hold one-to-ones. It's one thing to ask someone how you're doing, but to really be present for that conversation and to be present for the action that happens after that conversation is really important. And I think that is something that is really key when it comes to creating that psychological safety for your team.
I love those 3 different points as well, really thinking about how can we behaviorize those for managers? How can they, when they are going from meeting to meeting to meeting, feeling stretched, get into a place where when they are logging in or in person and in those one-on-ones, truly be present and think about those questions that they're asking. So even in those core skills, I love the idea of superpower skills. At LifeLabs, we call them the core skills, that no matter what your industry is, no matter what your role is, these are core skills that we see excellent managers really utilizing. And that idea of coaching skills, asking those questions, those follow-on questions, and being able to provide feedback. So Denequa, what you're mentioning even is that idea of, we think about this kind of in that team communications playbook that we sent along, as well as we're seeing a lot of companies use these user manuals. So as folks are coming in, they're newer to the organization, how do they want to be communicated with? What are their interests? And in terms of feedback is critical when it comes to manager training programs. How do we give feedback? And how do we think about managers receiving feedback? And even thinking about that feedback culture, one thing that we actually talk about at LifeLabs is really that idea of pulling for feedback. There's no better way of creating psychological safety and trust than teaching managers how to effectively ask for feedback in a specific and helpful way for their teams to start to model what an effective feedback culture looks like. So I actually wanted to hand this over to Kara and really thinking more about giving and receiving feedback. You had some really cool things when we were leading up to this conversation to really thinking about as much as feedback is probably like the number 1 most requested topic in terms of training, what if you noticed is how this has actually showed up in the work that you've done?
So I could probably go off on like a 9-hour TED talk on this. And so I'm going to spare you guys, spare everybody. So when it comes to feedback, I'm always going to give books here. So these are my 3 favorite books about feedback. It's Radical Candor, Fierce Conversations, and The Art and Science of Giving and Receiving Feedback. And so I think that a lot of companies want to have a culture of feedback, and they don't realize that there is psychology behind it. So just to give you, I'm going to go a little deep here, and I know this is 800 people, so I'm going to go there. I have asked an audience of 1,000 people before who had an example of healthy conflict, either in their community or in their home growing up, of like people knowing those skills of how to have a conversation of disagreement with each other and handling it in like a normal way. And no one ever raises their hand, right? So when we're thinking about building a culture of feedback, it might be the first time that people are learning how to handle conflict inside of the workplace. So we have to be very careful with this of understanding, hey, what are your fears? Whenever it comes to confronting and giving that feedback, what are your fears about asking people for feedback? And it's very possible to help people work through that. But I also think it's important to understand that it's a little bit more complicated than just going off and giving feedback, right? So, all right, my TED Talk is over on that, but we got to give people the skills. We got to get them and start having the conversation, but understand that it's a sensitive topic.
Absolutely, especially just given different experiences, different identities, different relationships to feedback, and how do we actually create more of that culture? Denequa, you've mentioned that you spent a lot of time really thinking about feedback in the programs that you've been working on. Can you share a little bit more about the processes that you've used and even some of the systems and software that you've used as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you said, Kara, about the feedback culture, because that's really where it starts. It's one thing to say, hey, we love to hear feedback here. Hey, give me your feedback. It's easy to say that, but to not put the vehicles and the processes in place and the practices in place that really allows your team members to do that, that's where it really counts. And in terms of, processes and tools, I mean, number one, shameless plug, we utilize AllVoices here at Brooklinen, and it has been something that the team has received so well. Other vehicles that we use that I won't spend a lot of time on because I want to really talk about some of the practices, but we have our annual engagement survey, we have a quarterly listening session, and we also utilize Lattice feedback feature. So that's where we give public praise where warranted throughout the company. But those are some vehicles that we have in place to make it easy for people to give and receive feedback. But in terms of practices, I think something that we encourage everyone to do is, one, utilize your one-to-one, specifically managers, utilizing that time to ask for feedback. And it might feel a little weird to ask, do you have feedback for me? The first time, the second time, you might not get any feedback, but the more you start to make that a habit, your direct reports start to expect it, and they start to engage and they start to prepare for that conversation. The other thing that we try to really emphasize here is giving feedback often and immediate. So not waiting until reviews, not waiting until there's a huge conflict, not waiting until someone's blood is boiling because they haven't been able to get it out. Delivering feedback at the time that it happens, because, when you address things in the moment, you really set yourself up to avoid conflict that could happen in the future. And then lastly, something that we really emphasize here is weekly updates, which is a feature we utilize in Lattice. And basically weekly updates allows you as the manager to set 2 to 3 questions on a weekly basis to go to your direct report. And it can be anything from, what roadblocks can I remove from your plate this week? How are you doing? How are you feeling? And the more you start to push those questions, the more you'll start to get some, answers from your direct report. And I think making those a practice, and the more that it happens and the more that you do these practices and utilize these tools, that is when it becomes infused inside your culture. So I think that is something that is really important, not just saying, here are the things that you can use to give us the feedback, but how are we putting it into practice, and how are we leading by example?
When we think about I think what I love where this conversation is even going is getting even more tactical around, yes, there's the theoretical skills that we need, but here are some actual ways to behaviorize this. Here's where we see this really showing up and see this being impactful. I know in the workshops that we lead as well, they have to be really thoughtful around some of these skills. We have to actually see people practice them again and again. But I would say one of the biggest questions that we get from clients is, how do we actually make this implicit understanding of what a good manager is more explicit, and specifically, how do we know that these programs that we're creating are successful? I think there's just like a money question that we could sort of kind of wind us down with. I would love to hear both of your perspectives on how do we measure the effectiveness of manager quality, maybe manager training programs, both the qualitative responses as well as the quantitative. What are some examples that you have noticed in measuring your results? And Denequa, I'll start with you on this one, and then I'll go to Kara afterwards.
I think, in administering many training and development programs, I think step one after it's over immediately is sending out a survey, any survey, however you utilize your surveys, whether it's a Google form, whether it's through Lattice, whether it's, a quick survey that you did through SurveyMonkey. It's really important to get that information as quickly as possible and while it's still fresh. So I think that's number one. But just to pull back a little bit at high level, I think two places that are really good sources of insight are engagement surveys as well as performance reviews, as far as measuring the performance of managers and how effective or efficient they are. I think performance reviews can be a little more quantitative in nature just because they more than likely incorporate a rating scale, which is usually probably consistent. And I think that is the most important thing when we're talking about measuring, is that the questions that you're using or the answers that you're asking for are very consistent, so that you can measure from year to year or review to review or survey to survey. And then the other thing is engagement surveys, which I personally find very effective because it really gives you the opportunity to measure very thematic data points that you can measure year over year. And I think what's really special about engagement surveys is it gives organizations the flexibility to make the questions whatever it is that you like and really tailor them to the things that you value as an organization. Some common questions are, my manager effectively and efficiently communicated expectations, or my manager always gives constructive feedback. So utilizing very simple, straightforward questions like that are really helpful. And I think the great thing about measuring effectiveness and efficiency is that you can be very flexible in the questions that you ask and how you sort of set up your performance reviews and your engagement surveys. So those are two sources of insight that I have always found really useful when we're talking about administering training programs and then also measuring the effectiveness of those training programs.
I love that. So there's like the time when to measure, and there's also the other consistent pulses that are taken on an organization. I know for us, when we're looking at measuring our effectiveness, we often talk about learning new skills. Sometimes it's difficult. There's I found this usefulness, but then actually seeing the results can be tricky to measure if we're looking for results right away. So using those surveys that happen consistently, we may not actually see improvement from an employee's perspective from those 180s or 360s until a couple of months later, when managers had that opportunity of practicing these skills. And that's why it can be useful to get not only the quantitative, but the qualitative feedback from those surveys. I have a bunch, like this could probably be my TED talk as well, but I'll hand it over to Kara. What are some of your thoughts on measuring the effectiveness of training programs?
Denequa, she covered it with her brilliant response there. That's usually, like what most organizations are doing is using engagement surveys, sometimes performance management, et cetera. We experimented a little with a pre and post 360 at one point in time, but I'll be really honest. This is a difficult area of how do you measure these superpowers and how people are using them. So I'm going to transfer this and tell you my dream. My dream is that we find a way to make it show up in a finance statement. So whether it's companies are measuring unwanted attrition, or they're measuring innovation, or they're measuring the bottom line, that gets linked to the way that the culture is thriving in an organization. I don't know what it's going to look like yet, but I think that when that happens, we're really going to find a way to be able to measure our leadership development programs and measure the culture work that we do in our organization. And we're going to get an even bigger seat at that table.
Yep. I love that perspective. And just even so much of the conversation of the folks that we have here today, even thinking about how can we leverage our knowledge, our expertise to really have more of that financial driven impact as well. Something that we've talked a lot about in previous sessions at LifeLabs is this idea of pulling for feedback and really thinking about getting that data not just during exit interviews, which is, and moving into what you could call stay interviews or using the 30, 60, 90, but then being able to utilize the differences there for an employee's experience. But I love that idea of going back to measuring retention. How does that actually fit to the bottom line? We all know how expensive it is to lose employees and then to train them back up. So here we are, we've kind of wrapped up what I've loved about the session, not only learning from both of you, your perspectives, so much to take home, but also for those of you that have been sharing in chat, asking questions with each other. I'm seeing resources and templates and books being shared. What I will say is that it's pretty easy to share, to save the chat. So before you head out, there's a couple of things that I want to share with you all in terms of resources. So number one, in the notes from today, you will all have access to again, the recording, the transcript, the PowerPoint. We'll be sharing a whole playbook, especially around managing in a hybrid and remote environment. So we'll send this playbook to you in the notes from today. I'm going to send an audit, so you can really assess what are those skills that managers currently have as we think about developing these programs going forward. And before I wrap, we would love to collect your feedback and your thoughts. So this isn't just words to say, but it's truly impactful in terms of how we think about these events going forward. Helps us know more about what we want to see in the future. So there's a poll that is launched here in terms of where you'd like to see more. There's lots of information coming in, which is really great. In terms of hearing more about where you'd like to get information. And then Kushbu, if you could put the link to the survey in chat, this is where we can get, make sure that we can stay in touch with you, make sure that we can hear your voice in terms of what you liked from today, what you would like to hear more of in the future. That would be super, super helpful. And then lastly, we're ending perfectly on time to be able to share who to reach out to. So from a resources perspective, here is the contact page if you want to hear more about LifeLabs, AllVoices, or Enborder.